The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Adelaide Cottage, casting long shadows across the wooden floors where Prince William sat in his favorite armchair, staring at the letter in his hands. The royal seal at the top seemed to mock him as he read the contents for the 5th time that morning. His coffee had grown cold an hour ago, but he hadn't noticed. The weight of the decision before him felt heavier than any crown he might one day wear. Catherine entered the room quietly, her bare feet making no sound on the polished wood. She had been watching her husband from the doorway for several minutes, noting the tension in his shoulders and the way his jaw clenched and unclenched as he processed whatever news the letter contained. After 15 years of marriage, she could read his moods like a well-loved book, and today's chapter was filled with uncertainty and fear. "William," she said softly, settling onto the arm of his chair and placing her hand on his shoulder. "You've been sitting here since dawn. The children are asking why Daddy looks so serious." He looked up at her then, his blue eyes reflecting a storm of emotions. Catherine had always been his anchor, the one person who could see past the titles and expectations to the man beneath. She wore a simple cream sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, looking nothing like the future queen she was destined to become. In moments like these, she was simply Kate, the woman who had stolen his heart at university and never given it back. "It's from the palace," he said, his voice hoarse from hours of silent contemplation. "Father wants to meet with us this afternoon. There are changes coming to the monarchy. Changes that will affect us directly." Catherine's hand still on his shoulder. King Charles had been on the throne for just over 2 years now, and, while the transition from his grandmother's 70-year reign had been smooth publicly, privately the family had been navigating new waters. The king had his own vision for the monarchy, one that was smaller, more streamlined, and more in touch with modern Britain. "What kind of changes?" she asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. There had been whispers in royal circles, conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, meaningful glances exchanged between courtiers that suggested something significant was brewing. William set the letter aside and pulled her down into his lap, needing the comfort of her presence. "He wants us to take on more responsibilities. Much more. The Prince of Wales' role is expanding beyond anything we anticipated." Catherine felt her stomach drop. They had always known this day would come eventually, when William would step closer to the throne, but they had imagined having years, perhaps decades, to prepare their children and themselves for the full weight of royal duty. "How much more?" she whispered. "He's stepping back from many of his engagements. The doctors have been concerned about his health. Nothing serious," he added quickly, seeing the alarm in her eyes, "but enough that they're recommending he reduce his workload significantly. He wants to focus on his passion projects while we take over the day-to-day operations of the monarchy." The words hung in the air between them like a thundercloud. Catherine had always approached her royal duties with grace and dedication, but this represented a fundamental shift in their lives. Gone would be the relative privacy they had fought so hard to maintain for their children. Gone would be the normal family moments that kept them grounded. "When?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "The formal announcement would be made next month. The transition would begin immediately after." William's arms tightened around her. "Kate, I know this isn't what we planned. I know we promised the children a normal childhood for as long as possible." Catherine closed her eyes and leaned against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. Through the window, she could hear George, Charlotte, and Louis playing in the garden with their protection officers, their laughter carried on the morning breeze. George, at 10, was just beginning to understand the weight of his future destiny. Charlotte and Louis, 8 and 5 respectively, still believed their father simply had an important job that required him to wear fancy uniforms sometimes. "The children," she murmured. "How do we explain to them that everything is about to change?" William had been wrestling with this exact question all morning. George had already started asking why his classmates' parents could attend every school event while his parents sometimes had to send regrets due to royal obligations. How could they explain that those obligations were about to multiply exponentially? "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice gaining strength. "We always have. And we'll do it together, as a family." But even as he spoke the reassuring words, William felt the familiar weight of destiny pressing down on him. His entire life had been building toward this moment, yet nothing could have truly prepared him for the reality of it. The casual conversations with school parents would become more guarded. The spontaneous family outings would require even more security and planning. The simple joy of being just William and Kate would become increasingly rare. Catherine straightened up and looked into his eyes. "What does your father expect us to say today?" "I think he expects us to accept." "This isn't really a request, Kate. It's the natural progression of things. With Harry gone and the rest of the family either too old or too removed from the direct line of succession, it falls to us." The mention of Prince Harry brought a familiar pang of sadness to both of them. The rift in the family had never fully healed, and moments like these highlighted how much smaller the working royal family had become. What was once a robust support system was now largely dependent on William and Catherine's shoulders. "I need to call my parents," Catherine said suddenly. "They deserve to hear this from us before it becomes public knowledge." William nodded. Michael and Carol Middleton had been extraordinary in their support of their daughter's royal journey, but this news would shake them too. They had watched their grandchildren grow up with unprecedented access, and that was about to change dramatically. As if summoned by their thoughts, the sound of running footsteps announced the arrival of their youngest. Louis burst through the door, his dark hair tousled and his cheeks pink from playing outside. "Mummy! Daddy! Charlotte won't share the football and George says I'm too little to play properly." His indignant expression was so serious that both parents couldn't help but smile despite the gravity of their conversation. Catherine scooped her youngest son onto her other knee, marveling at how normal this moment felt when their world was about to change so drastically. "Well, we can't have that, can we? Perhaps Daddy and I should come outside and referee this football match." Louis brightened immediately. "Can you?" "George will have to listen if you tell him to share." William met Catherine's eyes over their son's head, and, in that look, they made a silent agreement. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever sacrifices their new roles would demand, their children would always come first. They would find a way to protect their innocence for as long as possible while preparing them for their own futures. "Come on then," William said, standing up and lifting Louis high into the air, earning delighted squeals. "Let's go show George and Charlotte how football should really be played." As they made their way to the garden, Catherine caught William's hand. "We'll get through this," she said quietly. "Whatever happens at the meeting today, whatever changes are coming, we'll face them together." He squeezed her hand in response, drawing strength from her unwavering support. Outside, George and Charlotte were indeed engaged in a heated dispute over the football, while their protection officers maintained a respectful distance. For the next hour, William and Catherine threw themselves into the simple joy of playing with their children, treasuring these moments of normalcy before their world shifted permanently. But, even as they laughed and played, both parents were acutely aware that time was running out. The meeting with King Charles loomed ahead of them, and, with it, the formal beginning of a new chapter in their lives. The carefree days of being simply a family were numbered, and the weight of that knowledge colored every moment of joy with bitter sweetness. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting shorter shadows across the cottage garden, William and Catherine held onto each other and their children a little tighter, storing up these precious memories against the uncertain future that awaited them all. The drive to Windsor Castle felt longer than usual, though the familiar countryside rolled by at the same steady pace it always had. Catherine sat in the passenger seat of their Range Rover, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she watched the ancient trees lining the road. William drove in contemplative silence, occasionally glancing at his wife with concern. They had left the children at Adelaide Cottage with their nanny, promising to return by tea-time with news of their adventure to see Grandpa. The lie sat heavy between them, but how could they explain to three young children that their lives were about to change forever? That the careful balance their parents had maintained between royal duty and family life was about to tip dramatically in favor of the crown? "Remember when we used to drive this route for Sunday lunches?" Catherine said softly, breaking the silence. "When the biggest worry was whether George would behave himself at the dinner table?" William's smile was rueful. He still might not behave himself at the dinner table. Some things never change, even when everything else does. But they both knew that wasn't true. Everything was about to change, from their daily schedules to their children's security arrangements to the very way the public perceived them. They would no longer be the young royals finding their way, they would be the senior working royals carrying the future of the monarchy on their shoulders. As they approached the castle gates, Catherine felt the familiar flutter of nervousness that always accompanied formal meetings with her father-in-law. King Charles had been nothing but kind and welcoming to her throughout their marriage, but there was something about the formal atmosphere of these discussions that reminded her she was still, in many ways, an outsider who had married into this ancient institution. The guards waved them through with practiced efficiency, and soon they were pulling up to the private entrance of the castle. Edward, one of the king's longest-serving aides, was waiting for them with his usual diplomatic smile. "Their Majesties are waiting in the oak room," he said, falling into step beside them as they made their way through corridors lined with portraits of monarchs past. Catherine couldn't help but wonder if future visitors would one day walk past portraits of William and herself, and what kind of legacy they would leave behind. Queen Camilla was already seated when they entered the room, her warm smile immediately putting them at ease. She rose to greet them with genuine affection, kissing Catherine's cheek and squeezing William's hand with maternal comfort. "How are the children?" she asked, her concern evident. "This can't be easy timing with everything they have going on at school." Before Catherine could answer, King Charles entered the room, and immediately the atmosphere shifted to something more formal. He moved more slowly than William remembered, and there were new lines around his eyes that spoke of the weight he had been carrying since ascending the throne. "William, Catherine," he said, embracing his son and daughter-in-law warmly before gesturing for them all to sit. "Thank you for coming so quickly. I know this is all rather sudden." William took Catherine's hand as they settled onto the elegant sofa facing the king. "We understand the urgency, Father. Your letter made it clear that this couldn't wait." King Charles nodded gravely. "I'm afraid not. The Prime Minister and I had a lengthy discussion yesterday about the state of the monarchy and its role in modern Britain. There are challenges coming that we need to address head-on, and that means restructuring how we approach our duties." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. Catherine noticed the slight tremor in his hands as he reached for his teacup, and her heart clenched with sudden understanding. This wasn't just about transitioning responsibilities, this was about a man facing his own mortality and ensuring the institution he loved would survive and thrive without him. "The doctors have been quite frank with me," he continued, confirming Catherine's suspicions. "While there's nothing immediately life-threatening, they've made it clear that the pace I've maintained since the coronation isn't sustainable. I need to make significant changes to my schedule and responsibilities." William felt the familiar weight of duty settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. "What exactly are you asking of us?" "I'm asking you to step into the role I should have had 20 more years to teach you," King Charles said honestly. "The Commonwealth tours, the state visits, the major ceremonial functions, they need to transition to you sooner than any of us anticipated." Catherine's mouth went dry. Commonwealth tours meant weeks away from the children, often during school terms. State visits meant formal dinners and protocol that would consume entire weeks of their calendar. Major ceremonial functions meant being the face of the monarchy during its most important moments. "And the children?" Catherine asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. Queen Camilla leaned forward with understanding. "That's the hardest part, isn't it? I remember when my children were young and I was trying to balance everything. It feels impossible sometimes." "We'll make it work," King Charles said firmly. "The palace will provide whatever support you need. Additional staff, tutoring arrangements for when you're traveling, security upgrades, whatever it takes to make this transition as smooth as possible for George, Charlotte, and Louis." But Catherine knew it wasn't about logistics. It was about missing bedtime stories and school plays and sports days. It was about their children growing up with parents who were increasingly absent, increasingly public, increasingly scrutinized. "When would this begin?" William asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The formal announcement will be made next week," King Charles replied. "Your first major engagement under the new arrangement would be the Spring Commonwealth Tour. Australia, New Zealand, and Canada are expecting confirmation of your attendance by the end of the month." Spring was only 4 months away. Catherine felt dizzy thinking about how quickly their lives were about to accelerate. George would miss his mother for his school sports competition. Charlotte would have to understand why Mummy and Daddy couldn't attend her piano recital. Louis might forget what his parents looked like after 2 weeks of video calls from the other side of the world. "I need to ask you both to consider something else," King Charles continued, his voice gentle but firm. "This transition needs to be seen as a positive evolution, not a crisis response. The public needs to have confidence in the monarchy's future, which means you'll need to embrace these new responsibilities with enthusiasm, at least publicly." The subtext was clear: their personal feelings about this dramatic change in their lives could never be shared with anyone outside this room. They would need to smile and wave and speak about their excitement for their expanded roles, even if privately they were mourning the loss of their family's precious normalcy. William looked at Catherine, seeing his own internal struggle reflected in her green eyes. She had never asked for any of this. When she had fallen in love with him at university, she couldn't have imagined that 20 years later she would be asked to essentially give up her children's childhood for the good of the crown. "We need time to discuss this," William said finally. "To figure out how to explain it to the children, to make arrangements." Of course, King Charles agreed. "But not too much time. The palace machinery is already moving, and there are expectations to manage." As if on cue, Edward appeared in the doorway with a stack of briefing papers. "Your Majesties, the communications team needs final approval on the announcement strategy." The reality of their situation hit Catherine like a physical blow. This wasn't a discussion or a request, it was a fait accompli. The decision had already been made, the announcements were being prepared, and their consent was more of a formality than a genuine choice. "What if we say no?" she asked quietly, surprising everyone in the room, including herself. The silence that followed was deafening. King Charles looked genuinely shocked, while Queen Camilla reached out instinctively to touch Catherine's arm in understanding. "Catherine," William said softly, but she continued. "What if we say that our children need us more than the Commonwealth needs us? What if we say that George, Charlotte, and Louis deserve to have parents who are present for their childhoods?" King Charles's expression softened with something that looked like grief. "My dear, I understand more than you might think. I missed far too much of William and Harry's childhoods because of duty. But we serve something larger than ourselves, something that has provided stability and continuity for this nation for over 1,000 years. And what good is that stability if we destroy our own families in service of it?" Catherine asked, tears threatening for the first time since entering the room. The question hung in the air like an accusation. William reached for her hand, torn between supporting his wife and accepting his destiny. Queen Camilla looked between them all with the wisdom of someone who had watched the same struggle play out in generation after generation of the royal family. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "there's a way to find a middle ground. A way to fulfill these increased duties while still protecting the children as much as possible." King Charles nodded slowly. "We can certainly explore options. Shortened tours, strategic scheduling around school holidays, bringing the children on appropriate occasions." But Catherine knew that these were band-aids on a wound that would only grow larger with time. Once they stepped into this expanded role, there would be no going back. The demands would only increase, the children would grow up in the public eye whether they wanted to or not, and the simple family moments they treasured would become increasingly rare. As the meeting continued with discussions of logistics and timelines and public relations strategies, Catherine found herself thinking about her own childhood. Her parents had always been present, always available, always putting their children's needs first. How could she provide any less for George, Charlotte, and Louis? The weight of the decision before them felt crushing, even though the choice had essentially been made for them. They would say yes because duty demanded it, because the crown required it, and because walking away wasn't truly an option for the future king and queen. But, as they finally left Windsor Castle that afternoon, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that they were leaving more than just a meeting behind. They were leaving behind the last vestiges of the normal family life they had fought so hard to protect, stepping into a future that would demand everything from them and offer little in return except the cold comfort of duty fulfilled. The evening light was fading by the time William and Catherine returned to Adelaide Cottage, their silence during the drive home speaking volumes about the weight of the afternoon's revelations. As they pulled into their driveway, they could see the warm glow of lights in the windows and hear the distant sound of their children's voices raised in what sounded like a heated debate about homework. Catherine closed her eyes for a moment, trying to memorize this feeling of coming home to normal family chaos. Soon, their returns would be from overseas tours and state visits. Their children's voices would be more carefully modulated in the presence of increased security and staff, and moments like these would become precious memories rather than daily reality. "We need to tell them something tonight," William said as they sat in the car for a moment before going inside. "The palace communications team will brief the press tomorrow, which means the story will break within 48 hours. They deserve to hear it from us first." Catherine nodded, though her heart clenched at the thought of seeing the excitement in her children's eyes fade as they began to understand what this meant for their family. George, in particular, was old enough to grasp that increased royal duties meant less time with Mummy and Daddy. They found their children in the kitchen with Maria, their nanny, who was attempting to oversee homework while simultaneously preparing their dinner. Charlotte was practicing her spelling words with dramatic flair, Louis was building an elaborate tower with his vegetables rather than eating them, and George was staring at his mathematics with the expression of someone facing an insurmountable challenge. "Mummy! Daddy!" Louis abandoned his vegetable architecture immediately and launched himself into Catherine's arms. "Maria made shepherd's pie and I built a castle with the peas." "I can see that," Catherine laughed, her heart lightening despite everything as she spun her youngest son around. "It's a very impressive castle indeed." William ruffled George's hair affectionately. "How's the maths going, mate?" "Horrible," George replied with dramatic 10-year-old despair. "I don't understand why I need to know about fractions when I'm going to be king someday." "Kings don't do maths." "Oh, but they do," William said, settling into the chair beside his eldest son. "Kings need to understand budgets and economics and all sorts of mathematical concepts. But, don't worry, we'll work through it together after dinner." The casual mention of George's future role sent a pang through Catherine's chest. How much longer would they be able to help with homework? How many more evenings would they have for patient explanations of fractions and spelling practice? After Maria had served dinner and discreetly withdrawn to give the family privacy, William and Catherine exchanged meaningful glances across the kitchen table. The conversation they needed to have couldn't be delayed any longer. "Children," Catherine began carefully, "Daddy and I need to talk to you about something important. Something that's going to affect our whole family." The change in atmosphere was immediate. George looked up from his shepherd's pie with sharp intelligence in his eyes, while Charlotte stopped mid-sentence in her animated story about her friend's new puppy. Even Louis sensed the seriousness of the moment and put down his fork. "Are you getting divorced?" Charlotte asked bluntly, clearly having overheard conversations among her classmates about such matters. "No," both parents said simultaneously, with such vehemence that all three children relaxed visibly. "Nothing like that," William assured them. "Mummy and I love each other very much, and we love all of you very much. This is about Daddy's job, about the special work that our family does for the country." George's expression grew wary. At 10, he was becoming increasingly aware of what his father's job truly entailed, and he had already begun asking questions about what it would mean for his own future. "What about it?" he asked carefully. William took a deep breath. "Grandpa Charles has asked Daddy and Mummy to take on more responsibilities. Important responsibilities that will help support him as king." "Like what?" Charlotte asked, her curiosity overriding her caution. "Well," Catherine said, choosing her words carefully, "we'll be traveling more to represent the family and the country. We'll be visiting other countries and meeting with important people and attending special events." Louis's face lit up with excitement. "Can we come too? I want to see other countries." The innocent enthusiasm in his voice made both parents' hearts ache. Sometimes they might be able to bring the children, but more often they would have to leave them behind with nannies and protection officers while they fulfilled duties halfway around the world. "Sometimes you might be able to come with us," William said honestly, "but sometimes Mummy and I will have to travel on our own. It means we might be away from home more than we have been." The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. George was processing this information with the seriousness of someone far beyond his 10 years, while Charlotte looked confused and slightly alarmed. Louis seemed to be waiting for more details about the exciting prospect of international travel. "How much more?" George asked finally, and Catherine could hear echoes of her own question from that afternoon. "We're not entirely sure yet," William admitted. "But it will be significant. There might be times when we're away for a week or two at a time." Charlotte's fork clattered to her plate. 2 weeks? But what about my piano recital? And my birthday party? "We'll do everything we can to make sure we're here for important things like that," Catherine said quickly, though even as she spoke the words, she knew there would be conflicts. Royal tours weren't scheduled around 8-year-old birthday parties, no matter how much they might wish otherwise. "What about football practice?" Louis asked, suddenly, understanding that this might affect the things that mattered to him. "You always come to football practice." The simple trust in his voice nearly broke Catherine's resolve. Louis expected his parents to be present for the things that mattered to him, just as they always had been. How could she explain that duty to strangers might soon take precedence over duty to their own children? "We'll still come to football practice whenever we can," William promised. "And, when we can't be there, we'll make sure someone special is there to cheer you on." But they all knew it wasn't the same. Protection officers and nannies, no matter how caring, weren't parents. They couldn't provide the same comfort after a difficult loss or the same celebration after a triumphant victory. George had been quiet through this exchange, but now he looked up with eyes far too mature for his age. "Is this because I'm going to be king someday? Is this happening because of me?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Catherine felt her heart shatter a little. Her 10-year-old son was already carrying guilt for a destiny he had never chosen, already blaming himself for the sacrifices his family would have to make. "Oh, sweetheart, no," she said, reaching across the table to take his hand. "This is happening because Grandpa Charles needs our help, because our family has a responsibility to the country. It's not your fault, and it's not about you personally." But even as she spoke the reassuring words, Catherine knew that wasn't entirely true. The monarchy was built on hereditary succession, and everything they did was ultimately in service of preparing George for the throne he would one day inherit. Their increased duties were, in many ways, about ensuring the institution would be strong and stable when it passed to the next generation. "Will we have to move?" Charlotte asked, practical concerns beginning to surface. "Will I have to change schools?" "No changes to school or where we live," William assured her. "We'll still be here at Adelaide Cottage, and you'll still go to the same school with the same friends." "But you won't be here as much," George said flatly. It wasn't a question. William and Catherine exchanged another glance. Their son had cut straight to the heart of the matter with the directness that only children possessed. "We'll be here as much as we possibly can," Catherine said. "And, when we're not here, you'll have Maria and your protection officers and each other. We'll video call every day when we're traveling, and we'll make sure you know exactly where we are and when we're coming home." "It's not the same," George said quietly, echoing Catherine's own thoughts from earlier in the day. "No," William agreed honestly. "It's not the same. But, George, Charlotte, Louis, I need you to understand something important. We're not doing this because we want to be away from you. We're doing it because it's our job, our responsibility, just like you have responsibilities at school. But our responsibilities at school don't take us away from our families for weeks," Charlotte pointed out with irrefutable logic. William felt the weight of trying to explain concepts that he himself was still struggling to accept. How could he make his children understand the importance of duty and service when part of him questioned whether any duty was worth the price they would pay as a family? "You're right," he said finally. "It's different for us because we have a very special job that most people don't have. We represent our country and help take care of it, just like doctors help take care of sick people and teachers help take care of students learning. But doctors and teachers get to go home to their families every night," Louis observed with 5-year-old clarity. The innocent statement hit both parents like a physical blow. Their youngest son had identified the fundamental unfairness of their situation without even trying. Other people's important jobs allowed them to maintain normal family lives, but royal duty demanded everything. Catherine stood up abruptly and began clearing the dinner plates, needing a moment to compose herself before she broke down completely in front of her children. The simple act of stacking dishes gave her hands something to do while her mind reeled with the implications of the choice they were being forced to make. "When does this start?" George asked, his voice small and resigned. "The official announcement will be made next week," William replied. "But it won't all happen at once. There will be time to adjust, to figure out the best ways to make this work for our family." "Can we have a say in any of it?" Charlotte asked. "Can we tell them we don't want you to go away so much?" The hope in her voice was devastating. How could William explain that the Crown didn't negotiate with 8-year-olds, that royal duty wasn't subject to family votes, that some responsibilities couldn't be declined no matter how much they might want to? "We can certainly share your feelings with the people who help plan our schedule," Catherine said carefully, returning to the table. "And we promise that we'll always consider what's best for our family when we're making decisions about where to go and when." But they all knew, even the children in their own way, that this was a polite fiction. Once they accepted these expanded duties, their family's needs would become secondary to the Crown's requirements. They would fit their parenting around their royal obligations, not the other way around. The conversation continued for another hour, with the children asking practical questions and William and Catherine doing their best to provide reassuring answers they weren't sure they believed themselves. By the time they tucked the children into bed, everyone was emotionally drained but trying to maintain the appearance of normalcy. As Catherine kissed Louis goodnight, he wrapped his small arms around her neck and whispered, "Promise you'll always come back?" "Always," she whispered back, her voice thick with unshed tears. "No matter where we go or how long we're gone, we will always come back to you." It was a promise she meant with every fiber of her being, even as she wondered how many times she would have to break her children's hearts with temporary goodbyes before this royal duty was done with them all. The morning of the announcement dawned gray and drizzling, as if the weather itself was reflecting the somber mood that had settled over Adelaide Cottage. Catherine stood at her bedroom window, watching the rain streak down the glass while William spoke quietly on the phone with his private secretary, finalizing the last details of the press release that would change their lives forever. In just 3 hours, the world would know that the Prince and Princess of Wales were assuming significantly expanded roles within the monarchy. The careful language crafted by the palace communications team spoke of exciting new opportunities and a natural evolution of responsibilities, but Catherine knew the reality would be far more complex and emotionally challenging than any press release could convey. "The children are asking if they can watch the announcement on television," William said as he ended his call. "Apparently George has been Googling royal news all morning." Catherine turned from the window with a rueful smile. "Of course he has. He's been preparing himself for this day his entire life, hasn't he? Even when we didn't realize it was coming so soon." They had spent the previous evening having another difficult conversation with George, Charlotte, and Louis, trying to explain what the public announcement would mean and how it might affect their daily lives. George had listened with the stoic acceptance that worried Catherine more than tears would have. He was already learning to bury his emotions in service of duty, and he was only 10 years old. "I keep thinking about what George said last night," Catherine continued. "About whether this is all his fault. William, we're asking our children to sacrifice their childhood for an institution they never chose to be part of." William crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, both of them drawing strength from the familiar comfort of each other's presence. "We're not asking them to sacrifice anything. We're asking them to understand that our family has responsibilities that are different from other families." "Is there really a difference?" Catherine asked softly. "When Charlotte misses her mother at the school play because I'm touring Canada, does the reason matter to an 8-year-old? It was a question that had been haunting both of them since leaving Windsor Castle. The philosophical justifications for royal duty meant nothing to children who simply wanted their parents present for the milestones that mattered to them. A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation, and George peered around the edge with an expression of careful neutrality that reminded Catherine painfully of William at the same age. "The palace has called," he said formally. "They need to speak with you about final arrangements."
Both parents stared at their eldest son, struck by how easily he had slipped into the role of royal messenger. When had their 10-year-old learned to speak like a courtier? When had the innocent boy who built blanket forts and collected football cards started sounding like a miniature adult? "Thank you, George," William said gently. "Could you ask them to hold for just a moment?" But George didn't leave immediately. Instead, he stood in the doorway looking uncertain, as if there was something he needed to say but wasn't sure how to express it. "What is it, sweetheart?" Catherine asked, recognizing the signs of her son struggling with difficult emotions. "I just wanted you to know," George said carefully, "that I understand why you have to do this. And I want you to know that Charlotte and Louis and I will be okay. We'll look after each other when you're away." The simple maturity of the statement broke something inside Catherine's chest. Her 10-year-old son was already taking responsibility for his younger siblings, already accepting that he would need to be strong for others. The weight of his future crown was already shaping him, even though it might be decades before he would wear it. "Oh, George," she whispered, crossing the room to kneel in front of him. "You don't need to look after anyone except yourself. You're still a little boy, and it's our job to look after you." But, even as she spoke the words, Catherine knew they weren't entirely true anymore. George would need to grow up faster than other children, would need to understand concepts and carry burdens that should be years away. The announcement they were making today would accelerate that process whether they wanted it to or not. "I'm not that little anymore," George said with quiet dignity. "And, anyway, Charlotte and Louis might need someone to explain things when you're not here." "I can do that." William felt his throat tighten with pride and grief in equal measure. His son was displaying the same sense of duty that had guided the Windsor family for generations, but seeing it emerge in someone so young was both inspiring and heartbreaking. The phone rang again, insistent and urgent, reminding them that the machinery of the palace waited for no one, not even grieving parents trying to hold on to their children's innocence for just a few more moments. 2 hours later, they stood together in the blue drawing room at Windsor Castle, facing a carefully selected group of journalists and photographers who would share their news with the world. Catherine had chosen a navy blue dress that photographed well and projected the appropriate gravitas for the occasion, while William wore his naval uniform, the gold braid catching the light from the chandelier overhead. King Charles and Queen Camilla flanked them, presenting a united front as the monarchy prepared for its next evolution. But Catherine could see the slight tremor in her father-in-law's hands and the new lines around his eyes that spoke of health concerns he wasn't sharing publicly. "Ladies and gentlemen," the palace press secretary began, "Their Majesties have asked us to gather today to announce significant developments in the working arrangements of the royal family." Catherine felt William's hand brush against hers, a subtle reminder that they were facing this together. She thought about their children, safely back at Adelaide Cottage with Maria, probably watching this moment unfold on television. What did they think when they saw their parents standing so formally, speaking in the careful language of official duty rather than the warm, casual voices they knew at home? Effective immediately, the press secretary continued, "The Prince and Princess of Wales will be assuming expanded responsibilities within the monarchy, including leadership of major Commonwealth tours, increased patronages, and a more prominent role in state occasions." The questions came fast and pointed. How long would the tours be? How often would they travel? What about the children's education? How did this reflect on the king's health? Each inquiry felt like a small invasion of their family's privacy, even though they had known this scrutiny would come. William handled the formal questions with practiced ease, speaking about their excitement for the new challenges and their commitment to serving the Commonwealth. But Catherine could see the tension in his jaw, the slight stiffness in his posture that revealed how much this cost him emotionally. When a journalist asked directly about balancing increased duties with family life, Catherine stepped forward to answer. "Our children remain our top priority," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion churning beneath the surface. "We will continue to be present for them in every way possible, and any decisions about travel or engagements will always consider what's best for George, Charlotte, and Louis." It was the right answer, the expected answer, but, even as she spoke, Catherine wondered how many times she would have to repeat those words in defense of choices that felt increasingly difficult to justify. After the formal announcement ended and the journalists had been escorted away,
the family remained in the drawing room, suddenly, uncertain how to process what they had just done. They had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, made a commitment that would reshape their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand.
"Well," Queen Camilla said finally, "that's done then."
King Charles looked at William and Catherine with an expression that mixed relief and regret.
"I know this isn't easy," he said quietly.
"I know the sacrifices you're making, that the children are making. But I truly believe this is the right path forward for the monarchy."
Catherine nodded, accepting his words even as part of her wondered whether the monarchy's needs should always take precedence over a family's happiness.
But there was no point in expressing such doubts now. The decision had been made, the announcement delivered, and their new life was already beginning.
The drive back to Adelaide Cottage felt like traveling between two different worlds.
Behind them lay the formal palace environment where duty and protocol reigned supreme. Ahead waited their children, who would need reassurance and comfort as they processed what their parents' expanded role would mean for their family. They found George, Charlotte, and Louis in the sitting room, still gathered around the television even though the news coverage had moved on to other stories. All three looked up when their parents entered, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and apprehension.
"How was it?"
Charlotte asked, as if her parents had just returned from a particularly challenging school presentation. "It was fine," Catherine said, settling onto the sofa and pulling her daughter close. "Lots of serious adults asking serious questions, but nothing we couldn't handle."
"Did you tell them about us?"
Louis asked.
"Did you tell them we don't want you to go away?"
William sat down and lifted his youngest son onto his lap. "We told them that you three are the most important thing in the world to us, and that we'll always make decisions that are best for our family."
George looked up from where he had been quietly observing the family reunion. "What happens next?"
It was such a simple question, but it carried the weight of everything they were all wondering.
What did happen next? How did a family adjust to a complete restructuring of their lives? How did parents maintain their children's sense of security while embarking on responsibilities that would take them away for weeks at a time?
"Next," Catherine said, pulling all three children closer, "we figure out how to make this work for us. We learn how to be apart sometimes and how to make the times we're together even more special. We remind ourselves every single day that being a family is the most important job we have, no matter what else we're asked to do." As the afternoon faded into evening, the family settled into their usual routines: homework help, dinner preparation, bedtime stories, but everything felt different now. Each ordinary moment carried the weight of impending change, each laugh and hug and casual conversation a treasure to be stored against the uncertain future ahead. Later that night, after the children were asleep and the house had grown quiet, William and Catherine sat together in their bedroom, finally, able to process the day without maintaining brave faces for anyone else.
"Do you think we did the right thing?"
Catherine asked, voicing the question that had been haunting her all day. William was quiet for a long moment.
"I think we did the only thing we could do," he said finally.
"Whether it was right or not, it was necessary." Outside their window, the lights of their protection officers' vehicles provided a reminder that their lives were already far from ordinary. Tomorrow would bring the first planning meetings for their expanded duties, the first concrete steps toward a future that would demand everything from them. But tonight, they were simply William and Kate, parents who loved their children and each other, trying to find a way to serve their duty without losing their souls in the process. The announcement had been made, the path forward set, but the most important work, holding their family together through the challenges ahead, was just beginning. As Catherine finally drifted off to sleep, she held on to the memory of her children's faces at dinner, still young and trusting despite everything that was changing around them. Whatever sacrifices lay ahead, whatever difficulties they would face, she was determined that George, Charlotte, and Louis would never doubt that they were loved completely and unconditionally by parents who would move heaven and earth to protect them, even within the constraints of royal duty. The future was uncertain, the challenges ahead daunting, but they would face them together as a family, bound by love that no amount of protocol or duty could diminish.